I'm making another video on stereotypes because this book has a few of them that I thought were interesting. The biggest one that a lot of us noticed, and I actually have a post on the male and female dynamic, was there was a stereotype when it came to men and women, and there was one particular passage that I want to point out. It's basically it talks about the air balloon that Fermina gets on. And that it was talking about Fermina coming off she wore coming off the balloon expedition. She rode an uncommon Vespi that resembled something from a circus, with a very high front wheel, over which she was seated, and a very small black wheel that gave almost no support. She wore a pair of loose trousers trimmed with red, which scandalized the older ladies and disconcerted the gentlemen, but no one was indifferent to her skill. So, just because she wore a pair of trousers, the old women, were like, and the gentlemen were like, because apparently women didn't wear pants back then. Now, this was back in the 80s sometime, maybe. I'm not exactly sure. But, if you think about it, that's like the patriarchal society where women have to dress decently. They have to wear a dress. They cannot wear pants because they are showing their figure too much or something. And even earlier in the book, it talks about women where, Fermina's mother-in-law says, "I do not believe in decent women who do not know how to play the piano," which is another women's stereotype from back then, that women had to know a certain skill, like sewing, an instrument, piano in this case, but they actually got a harp instead. And it's that whole stereotype of what a woman is supposed to be, what a woman should be, and then what a man should be, where a man should be the one in charge. The man is not, must run the house and run everything and be the one who is a man's man, as it were. And it talks about the masculinity of a man, where Florentino himself goes through baldness, and for him, losing his hair is almost terrible, where he's like, it kind of makes him, he thinks it makes him less attractive, but then he embraces it later because he realizes there's nothing he can do about it. It's a part of old age. But then he doesn't care that he loses all his teeth, which is strange, but I guess in the circumstance, you can't tell if somebody has fake teeth nowadays. Really. And even back then, I don't know if you could tell or not. You probably could. But I'm getting sidetracked. The one big stereotype I really want to talk about that I thought was kind of funny, in a sense that reminded me of American stereotype, is when they talk about the Chinese immigrant who wins the poetry festival. I thought it was funny that the book included this. The book said about Chinese that when they arrived, like many others who had stayed here until they died, living in Chinese, reproducing in Chinese, and looking so much alike that no one could tell one from the other. And then in a few years, 4 narrow streets were overflown with other unexpected Chinese who came into the country without leaving a trace in the custom records. In other words, the Chinese were everywhere, and they didn't know where they had come from. And they looked so much alike they couldn't tell the difference. And when Fermina announces his name, she has a hard time saying it, where he's Chinese. And this constitutes the stereotype that the Chinese all look alike. And there's another stereotype they talk about the popular view of good Chinese and bad Chinese. And we're talking about people, not food. The bad ones were those in the lugubrious restaurants, along the waterfront, where one was likely to eat like a king as to die a sudden death at the table, sitting before a plate of rat meat with sunflowers, and which were thought to be nothing more than the fronts for white slavery and many other kinds of traffic. The good ones were the Chinese in the laundries heirs to the sacred knowledge, who returns one's shirts cleaner than new, with collars and cuffs like recently ironed communion wafers. The man who defeated 72 well-prepared rivals in a polite festival was one of these good Chinese. And when Firmino read out the name, no one understood because it was an unusual name because no one knew for certain what Chinese were called. So they didn't, it was kind of interesting that the book decides to focus on the Chinese, the good and the bad. And it's that stereotype in America where a Chinese laundry is a good place to take your laundry because you know they'll do a good job. I'll admit, in my neighborhood we have very few laundromats. And the few that we do have, there might be one or two that's run by a Chinese. Most of the Chinese in my neighborhood personally run restaurants. Now here's the restaurant bit. I'll admit to love Chinese, but that's a stereotype where you're not exactly sure what you're eating, but you know it's pretty good. You feast like a king, but then you're like, ugh, you know. And it talks about rat meat. I actually have a personal story, not about that kind of meat, but about a different kind of meat that's more disturbing. A restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, it was actually a buffet, closed, and because they had been caught in health violations and because they had been serving stray cat illegally. And I say serving, I mean they're actually using them. Now that disgusted me personally because I actually ate there. So it's always be cautious with whatever you order. I know that that's a stereotype as far as the Chinese market goes with restaurants and such, and even wherever this takes place, which that's the top of my head I can't think of, they didn't trust their food, but they knew they would do their shirts well. So it's that whole dynamic. And the final stereotype I want to mention is the elderly. I talked about in my second explicit love video that is, age in regards to love, where old people should not be in love at a certain age. But that's not necessarily true. You can be in love. It's just awkward for other family members, I guess, because your life is coming to a close and now the sun and this is going on. It kind of throws you through a loop. You don't really see it coming. And that's the whole thing with Fermina and Florentino at the end as well. You don't see this. You kind of know something's going to happen, but in a sense you don't really see it coming. And there's also the stereotype of old people not knowing what's good for them, or not being keenly aware. And there are some elderly with this, it depends on the situation really, as far as elderly people or older people. In regards to their wisdom, they know a lot of things, but their memory may be lapsing. They can possibly take care of themselves, but they also need help in other things. They're not as strong as they used to be. And it's a stereotype that is sometimes true for a few people, but not everybody. So I think it's important to note that the stereotypes mentioned in this book are not true for everyone or everything, and some of the stereotypes relate to how society viewed things as well, when it came to women being proper ladies and gentlemen being gentlemen running the household. So I thought that was kind of an interesting take on the book. What do you see as stereotypes, or what do you think of what I listed as stereotypes? I'm looking forward to seeing what everyone thinks about this.